Welcome to Tomorrow Never Knows with me, Bob Wilson, and graphic artist Wonderboy Sir Warren Brown. Today, we welcome Mr. Ivor Davis into the Beatles Kingdom. We'll discuss why the Beatles decided to let it be in 1970, and also Ivor's latest work, Manson Exposed. Lend us your ears and we'll give you a show, but first, a word from Beatles Magazine. Beatles Magazine is a publication with 370 plus million visitors in all their pages, read by thousands of fans around the world every day. Beatles news is updated daily, 24 hours, audio, video, photos, interviews, contests, you say, additional materials, and more. Follow Beatles Magazine, the most complete online coverage, 24 hours a day. And how many days a week, fellas?
8 days a week.
8 days a week. I love it. Love it. And welcome to our guest. Welcome, Ivor Davis.
Thank you so much, and nice to be with you again.
It's always nice to have you, for certain. You're my favorite. Now, tell us, Ivor, how did you come to be in the Beatles' entourage, and even more just being in their entourage? You were writing a column, I believe, for one of the lads back in '64. And what led up to that magic moment of kismet when you wound up with the lads?
Well, magic happens when you least expect it. And what happened to me in 1964 was I happened to be the West Coast correspondent for a big London newspaper called the London Daily Express. And I was covering Hollywood and America and politics. And I got a call, and my editor in London said, "Get on the plane to San Francisco. The lads are arriving." I said, what lads? And he said, the Beatles. And in fact, so I jumped on a plane from LA and landed in San Francisco. I went by taxi to the Hilton Hotel, and there were thousands of girls outside screaming. And I thought, how did they know I was arriving? But it wasn't for me they were screaming. No, it was for the Beatles, I discovered. And then when I got into the hotel, I had to fight my way in, and I had a name called Derek Taylor. Thank heavens I had his name, because they wouldn't have let me in. I went up to Derek Taylor's suite, and there were the four lads. They just arrived from England. They were absolutely jet lagged. They were tired. They were half dozing, but they were watching television. They were watching themselves arrive at San Francisco International Airport. And they were so thrilled they were using a remote control to click the sound and everything, because they didn't have remote controls for television back in '64 in England. And then I was introduced to the four lads by Derek Taylor, their press man, and the boys were a bit exhausted, and they blew me off, if you like. But that didn't last, and as soon as I got to know them on the road to everywhere for 5 weeks, they became friends, and I became like the Beatles family, instant family. And I always like to say, it was a sensational ticket to ride.
Well, that is a good way to put it. You certainly had a unique vantage point at that point in time. Now, the Beatles had stereotypes. We had a cute Beatle, a smart Beatle, a lovable hound dog Beatle, a quiet Beatle. Compared to their stereotypes, what were the Beatles really like? Did they fall into those categories, or were they more complex people, or even different than those categories they got put into so often?
Well, in a way, the categories they were put into were quite reasonable, because don't forget, these guys, these young lads from Liverpool on their first American tour, were young. Their personalities didn't quite develop to the way we got to know them over the years. So what I found was Ringo, young guy, sweet guy, not very talkative then, believe it or not. Uh, George Harrison was, I mean, I hate to say this, but George was a bit surly at first. I mean, I was there also to write George's column, a great column. George was going to tell me every day what happened to him, give me his innermost thoughts, and I was going to write a column for my newspaper. Well, to be honest with you, George slept late, and George didn't spend much time telling me what went on in his mind. He didn't. So for the first week or two for the column, I had to make it up. Sorry about that. But George saw the column in London. I think his mother called him and said, "George, you look as though you're having a miserable time." George got me in the plane, the private jet that they rented to fly all over America, and he said, "My mum says the column is boring." I said, "George, would you sit down with me for half an hour once a day and tell me what's going on? Tell me your opinion." And George shrugged and said, "Yeah, okay." And after that, we got along very well, and the columns improved. Now, Paul was and is today a great guy, a socializing wonder man, easy to know, easy to talk to, glib if you like, but quite charming. And so I liked Paul because Paul would come along on the jet as we flew from one city to another city, say, "How you doing, Ivor? Would you like a gin and tonic?" And I said, "Sure, Paul." And he bought me a gin and tonic, and I never tipped him for that. So
I think he's done okay.
He's doing all right. He doesn't need my tips. I think he made a few shillings, as we say, more than a few shillings, as you said. And then John, John was a once in a lifetime guy. I mean, he was funny. He could mimic everybody. He had a wicked sense of humor. He loved to needle you. For about the first 3 weeks, when I told him my name was Ivor, he said, "No, hello, Ivan." I said, "It's Ivor." He said, "You're Ivan the Terrible." I said, "All right, John, if that's the way you want it." But he was fun, and if you gave him as good as he gave you, and he had a great sense of humor. So that was the Beatles. Young men, absolutely blown over by the receptions they got in every single city across America in 1964. And the great joy was I was there to record it and see it and get to know them.
So as you got to know them, in such a way, you're traveling right with them. That's fairly incredible. That's such a key moment in rock and roll history. You got to, they're brushing their teeth, playing Monopoly, all these other things going on. As a little time goes by, and maybe you're watching from afar a little more, how did you see them develop and mature? How did they change?
Well, I think they changed because they were very nervous when I first met them about what kind of reception they'd get in America. Because Brian Epstein, their manager, was also very nervous because Brian knew that many of the big rock stars that came from England to the United States, got blown away by the fact that not too many people are interested, and the fact that every stadium the Beatles played was jam-packed, sold out, and they were being loved and adored, and it was a huge hit, and they were making a lot of money, gave them the inner confidence that they needed. I mean, they were successful in Europe, but they were not successful in North America until 1964. And so I could see them maturing in a 6-week period. They got a lot more confident. They had these wonderful press conferences every stop of the way. I always remember in Toronto, we arrived at the airport. We'd been in Toronto 9 minutes and 30 seconds. And somebody said, John, what do you think of the Canadian women? Well, come on, John's been there 10 minutes. He hasn't seen a Canadian woman. But one of the other Beatles jumped in and said, "Oh, they're gorgeous, beauty contest winners." Oh, stuff like that. The Beatles were like the Marx Brothers comedy team. They worked off each other. They could think of each other's punchlines to jokes, and they were just loving every minute of it. But what they didn't love, of course, was the noise at their concerts, because honestly, the Beatles couldn't hear themselves play, and me sitting in the front row couldn't hear what the Beatles were singing. I had to kind of guess, because at every show, Brian gave us a sheet telling us which songs they were about to sing. And they only sang about 10 songs, but you couldn't hear it, because the moment the Beatles came on stage, 15,000, 20,000, 30,000 girls began to scream nonstop. And it drowned them out. But the girls actually came to see the Beatles rather than to hear them. And later on, the Beatles said they didn't like that. They wanted to be heard and appreciated for their music.
Now, as time went on, and like maybe you saw them from time to time or just watching their career, at any point before, they broke up and such, did you notice at any point when a rift maybe started to happen because they were maturing or getting tired of the touring or the things that were wearing them down? Were you ever sitting around reflecting and you maybe saw a point in time when they might break up before it happened?
Well, I knew that they were upset at the fact that nobody came to hear them, they came to see them. And John, I think the last year, 1966, of the American tour, said to me at a party that, we were like performing fleas. We don't like this. And then, of course, in 1966, they got bad treatment in the Philippines. And when they came back to America in 66, there was all this stuff. John got death threats because he said the Beatles were more famous than Jesus Christ or something along those lines. And they were scared because a lot of people burnt their records. So by 1966, 67, the Beatles felt that they were at the end of the road, and particularly as touring. And in fact, anybody, and you guys know Beatle history, the last concert they ever performed live was in San Francisco in 1966. Now, you're going to say, what about the rooftop performance? Well, that was a rooftop performance for a limited handful of people in London. And so in 1966, they decided to quit performing live. And so I could see that was happening. And then I was also familiar with Derek Taylor, and Derek Taylor was their press secretary, their pal, their confessor, and all that sort of stuff. And Derek kind of indicated that maybe the Beatles wouldn't tour anymore. And then, of course, a few years later, I think it was in 1967, you can probably correct me, Bob, but 67, Brian Epstein died, and that was the beginning of the end.
Now, my next question was about Brian Epstein. He's a very enigmatic figure to a fan, because I realized looking back, now everybody at some point, in our age of video and technology and the internet, everyone is interviewed. But when you go back and look at Brian Epstein, I can't find, maybe it's out there and I haven't seen it, but an extensive interview with him at all. There's snippets, a little blurb, but he never really gave an interview that I saw. So he's very mysterious, and we know more about his background, but when they lost him, it seemed to really greatly affect them. When you were touring with them so closely, did you get, what was the relationship like between them and Brian? How important was he to the mix? Anything you can tell us about Brian? Because even as a big fan since I'm 5 years old, I really don't know much about Brian Epstein.
Yeah. Brian Epstein lived in Liverpool. He was an upper class boy who worked in his parents' furniture store, which they then had a corner of the store to sell records. So Brian suddenly found himself a bit of a music maven in Liverpool. But the story is well known, of course. Brian goes to the Cavern. He likes the boys. He signs them up. They're delighted to sign with him. He cleans them up. He puts the suits on. He gets them their haircuts. He creates a new image. and pow, the Beatles hit the world. But Brian also wanted them to be a huge success in America, and when they were, he was delighted. The funny thing about Brian was that he was a secretive guy. I got to know him because we sort of came from similar backgrounds. When I say similar backgrounds, I was not well-to-do, but I was Jewish growing up in England after the World War II, and also I had been forced or had to do military service in the British Army, and Brian did as well. So we hit it off from those points of view. We had a common background from that point of view. Right. Brian, of course, was a homosexual, and in those days, gay people could be arrested for their sexual preference. In fact, Brian was arrested several times, but that almost destroyed him. So you've got to realize here is a guy, a shrewd businessman in a way, and he knew that he wasn't the star. His 4 boys were the star, and that was his feeling. He felt like he was like a benevolent headmaster. I used to see him at all the press conferences, and he's clacking away with annoyance because John was smoking a cigarette and blowing it at the media during a press conference. Or John stood around doing an interview with his hands in his pockets. Or John did something that offended him as a gentleman. And so Brian would kind of take John aside and give him a lecture. So there was this relationship with John, which was very close. But at the same time, if there was a dispute among the Beatles, if they argued among themselves, Brian was the ultimate man who determined the answer. He was their judge and their jury. He kept the peace. Of course, 4 guys are going to argue over silly things, but Brian was the oracle and the man whose opinion they believed, although they did pull his leg quite a bit. So when Brian died and there was no leadership, that was the beginning of the end of the Beatles as we know them, because things disintegrated. And I will tell you what I know if you would like me to continue with that.
Absolutely, theme. Please. I don't know much about him, and you're an insider, and you have great insight. Please do.
Yeah, so once Brian died, they had no rock. He was their rock. He was their guidance. He was the guy with the vision. He was the guy that persuaded Ed Sullivan to put them on the Ed Sullivan Show, which in 1964, February 1964, was a sensation in America. Brian went to America. He saw Ed Sullivan. He got a commitment for Ed Sullivan to put the Beatles on the show in February 1964. And wow, that was a smash hit, because over 70 million people tuned into Ed Sullivan and the Beatles, as he said. And so Brian was the pilot, if you like, of the ship. Once he died, there was nobody there. There was a lot of talk about them breaking up. And then it was like a bad divorce. They all got their, quote, lawyers, but they weren't lawyers, or well, they were lawyers. I mean, Paul McCartney married Miss Eastman, and Linda had a father and a son who were sharp showbiz lawyers, and they took Paul aside and told him how he could protect his fortune, because up until then the Beatles were not making a fortune. And then John, of course, met Yoko, and Yoko was he was besotted. John was besotted by Yoko, so much so that she had a strong influence on what he decided. And so they sort of, the separation was gradual, but inevitable. And then, of course, John got a guy to manage his end of the deal, a guy called Alan Klein, who was a sort of a pit bull of a business manager. So you had Alan Klein in the ring against the Eastmans, and it got a bit nasty. And so, like any bad divorce, there were insults and there were arguments and there were screaming meetings. And in the end, finally, 50 years ago, this year, the Beatles were over. Sad, but that was it. And I guess it was inevitable. John, of course, went on to marry Yoko because Yoko was no shrinking violet. She was no Cynthia, his first wife. She knew where she wanted to go. She still knows where she wants to go. And it was all over for the Beatles. I must tell you that a few years ago, John had told me when I saw him in LA before he died, more than a few years ago, that he had met Muhammad Ali. And Ali said to him after the Beatles broke up, do you think you guys can get together again and do a concert in New York? So there was a possibility of them getting together again, but of course, after the breakup, it never happened.
Well, that's an interesting insight into Brian Epstein, and also the end there is quite. Maybe Warren could go into that a little more in depth with you later about a possible reunion. I was wondering your thoughts on that, but I hand over to Warren.
Thank you, Bulldog. And first of all, Ivor, I'd like to welcome you to the show.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you on again. And I'm going to start off by asking about Elvis. Were you there when Elvis met the Beatles, and what might that have been like?
Well, I was there. I was very fortunate to be there, and it was in the summer of 1965. Now, the reason the Beatles got together with Elvis was twofold. First of all, John was a great fan of Elvis, and John told me that he used to, when he was home in Liverpool, he used to listen to a radio station called Radio Luxembourg, and Radio Luxembourg started playing Elvis's first big hits, Heartbreak Hotel, Blue Suede Shoes, and John loved that music. And of course, the Beatles became big. Elvis was huge even by then. And in 1964, on the first American tour, there was no time to meet Elvis. And or even though Colonel Parker, who was his manager, met with Brian Epstein at the Beverly Hills Hotel and had lunch with him and said, let's get our boys together. It never happened in 1964. In 1965, when the Beatles came back to America and were living in a rented house in LA, I got a call from Mal Evans, who was the road manager, and he said, get over here because we're going to see Elvis. So I sort of raced over there, went with them in the limo, and we were at Elvis's house in about 10 minutes. And strangely enough, when we got to Elvis's house, there were a lot of girls outside, and the Beatles thought, this is a private meeting. How do they know? But, I think Mr. Colonel Parker, I'm not too sure what he was a colonel of, but Colonel Parker had tipped off somebody, and so the girls were there. So as the Beatles were going over there, they were imbibing with a touch of a few cigarettes. They used to say, let's get a cup of tea, but then what they meant was, let's have a few puffs of the ciggy. And by the time they got there, they were quite merry. And then we all got out in the driveway and walked into the house. And it was a large house. And there was Elvis sitting on the couch. And he looked like Elvis. He looked like the Elvis image that we all knew. Dressed in Elvis tight-fitting clothing. And I always like to say this because it was so true. He had sideburns like what I described as shag carpeting, thick sideburns. But so there was the Beatles, Colonel Parker, Brian, and nobody introduced them. I mean, it was kind of ridiculous. If you go into a room, you would have said, hello there, Bob. Hello there, Warren. This is Ivor. Good to meet you. No. So they sat around, and Brian Epstein went into the other room to play snooker. Ringo went in to play snooker. Finally, they all got back in the room, and finally somebody introduced them to Elvis. Elvis was getting a bit peeved. I mean, Elvis then, a young lady with a bouffant hairstyle, 5 foot tall bouffant, young woman. I discovered that was Priscilla. It was Priscilla but she was about 4'11" in her high heels, and then another 3'6" in her bouffant hairstyle, which actually was the fashion of that era. Bouffant hairstyles. You know, you could have built probably a skyscraper on the hair. Anyway, so so Elvis then says, "Listen, you guys, I thought we came here to jam. If you don't want to do that, I'm going to bed." Well, that broke the ice, and so the boys started to jam. Ringo got stuck in the billiard room because he didn't have a set of drums. They brought the guitars out, and for about 15 minutes, or 20 minutes, they started performing music. I mean, it was mostly like not Beatle music, like Roll Over Beethoven, black Southern stuff that Elvis led them in this little concert. And after they finished playing for 15, 20 minutes, they were loose and relaxed, started the conversation with each other, conversation about Elvis saying how he was scared of flying. And the Beatles said they weren't crazy about flying because I think not sometime earlier, Buddy Holly had died in a plane crash, and other rock and rollers died in plane crashes. So the evening that started off like a near disaster ended up quite warmly. The Memphis Mafia guys saw the Beatles out of the door, and it was considered moderately successful, not a smash hit. And in fact, I'll tell you this, that the day later, we talked to the Beatles about meeting Elvis, and they were a bit, lukewarm. And then 15 years later, when the Beatles anthology came out, they'd reviewed the situation and decided it was much more exciting than they first thought. So when you see the Beatles anthology, you'll see them praising visiting Elvis. But at the time, it was a bit, I don't know, didn't go on the boil, put it that way.
Right.
But the other thing I should add, Warren, is this, that you've got to remember that Elvis was a bit jealous of the Beatles, and not surprising. Number one, he was no longer number one on the hit parade.
Mm-hmm.
The Beatles knocked him off. Number two, Elvis was making 3 movies a year. 3 movies a year for about 6 years, and wasn't very happy about that. And then the Beatles come along that summer, and they bring out a Hard Day's Night, and it's a smash hit around the world. People rave about it. So Elvis was a little bit perturbed about the Beatles. They said they were going to get together. They never got together. And then I remember, what happened was Elvis Presley wanted to get friendly with Richard Nixon, the president. He went to see him at the White House. Elvis took Nixon a present, walked through the doors of the White House, and handed Nixon a couple of 6 guns. Can you imagine that happening at the White House today?
Yeah.
So he gave him the gift, and then, because we have it on record, Elvis then badmouthed the Beatles and said, these guys came from England, they earned all that money, they went back to England and badmouthed America. Well, that didn't happen.
No, it didn't.
Elvis was trying to ingratiate himself with President Nixon. I don't know why he wanted to do that, and so when the Beatles heard that, Ringo particularly was incensed that Elvis, who they thought was a sort of friend, should give them such a bum rap about them. So the relationship was not a very good one, even after Elvis died.
Okay, great story. I'm interested in how you as a person felt. You were around greatness, being around the Beatles, And when you went to Elvis's place with the Beatles, how did you feel about this situation?
Well, you've got to remember, Warren, two things. In the 1960s, I didn't know I was around greatness. The Beatles didn't know they were that great. They were terrific. They were great successes. But it wasn't until time passed, decades rolled by, the people suddenly started appreciating the Beatles for their place in rock and roll history and stuff like that. And the same, in a way, applies to Elvis, because Elvis was popular, hugely popular, a rock star, a person whose life you followed from A to Z. But you know, we didn't have the ability of history to say these guys were legends, although we knew they were going to be big, big, big. I mean, Elvis was a huge talent, and I'm not an Elvis expert, but let me say that I interviewed Elvis twice. On one occasion, I went to see him on one of his films at Paramount Studios. I went in to see him. We had a meeting for about 20 minutes, which is not long enough for an interview. And somebody came in from the film set. I forget the film. It was with I forget the name of the actors. Mary Ann Mobley and Margaret, one of those, the rather lovely but interchangeable leading ladies that he had in every film. And so after 15 minutes of conversation, which Elvis really was not happy doing interviews. Elvis, he was strangely private in his own way, and he didn't unload to strangers, and I was a stranger. So after 15 to 20 minutes of rather humdrum conversation, a man came into the dressing room and said, "Oh, Al, they want you on this film set." So I said, "Thank you." And I said, "Goodbye, Elvis. Nice to meet you." I mean, it was a terrible interview. I don't even remember what Elvis said. Not much. And as I was driving out, I saw half a dozen guys in the parking lot throwing a football around. And guess who was throwing the football around?
Elvis and the Memphis Mafia.
Yeah. Elvis with his Memphis football mafia guys, you know. I mean, Elvis just wanted to be rescued. And that's the way they rescued him. But he was like that. And I'll tell you one other thing. I saw Elvis in one of his last concerts at the Hilton Hotel, because Elvis did about 600 performances at the Hilton Hotel in Las Vegas. And he did it because Colonel Parker signed him to a contract in which he had to do all these concerts. In return, Colonel Parker got a free suite of offices in the Hilton Hotel, and many of his gambling debts were forgiven at the Vegas casino because Colonel Parker liked to play the tables. So poor Elvis was under a slave labor condition at the hotel. So the last performance, I must tell you this, it was one of the last performances. And Elvis, I was sitting with another journalist, a guy called Colin Dangard, a kind of a rough and ready Australian journalist. And Elvis was fat. I mean, he really was. He was just overweight, not very good. And Colin Dangard, sitting at our table, pulled out a camera and snapped a few pictures. And within 10 seconds, security came over, grabbed Colin, dragged him out, and threw him out and confiscated his camera. So it was a sad thing. Elvis was there. He was past his peak, only because I know a little bit about it. I've read a lot of stuff. I interviewed Priscilla. Elvis was heavily into drugs, and it got him down. And as everybody in the world knows, he died much too young.
I think he died with 16 drugs in his system. I don't mean to interrupt you guys.
But you know, no matter how much of a Superman you are, 16 drugs, Bob, in your system is suicide, isn't it? Almost.
Yes, it is.
I don't mean to make it make this a rather mournful conversation. But Elvis, I mean, can you imagine if Elvis had lived? I mean, a great singer, which has got nothing to do with that died the other day was, I think, was it Bill Withers? Brilliant singer.
Stand by Me.
Stand by Me. Ain't no sunshine when she's gone. I mean, what a songwriter and singer. Elvis never wrote any of his songs, did he? But anyway, I don't know why I brought that up, because I loved Withers and I loved those songs. And Withers, and I know we're not talking about him, probably didn't get the acclaim that he deserved in his lifetime. Anyway, sorry to bring that in, but
no, I'm glad you brought him up. Thank you.
Yeah.
He's a great singer and a great songwriter.
Right.
Okay, Ivor. Our host, Bob Bulldog, is a great big Bob Dylan fan. Can you tell us about the lads meeting Dylan?
Yes. Bob Dylan was a character, a brilliant poet, a brilliant writer, a man. I mean, I have great admiration for his lyrics. As an individual, he was a little bit odd. I'll tell you a story I haven't told you before, but I was working for Los Angeles Magazine, and they said to me, Bob Dylan is building his palace in Malibu. Would you do a story? So I went over to Malibu, and I looked at this kind of Taj Mahal that Bob Dylan was building, and suddenly a guy in a Jeep showed up and said to me, "What are you doing here?" And I thought I knew it was Bob Dylan, but he kind of kept himself hidden in the Jeep. It was one of those covered Jeeps. And I said, "Oh, what's going on here?" Because I thought he obviously didn't want to tell me who he was, although I knew who he was. And we played a game for 10 minutes. And I asked him about the place, and he kind of gave me sort of half answers. But he didn't say, "This is my house and I'm building it because I love this style." I mean, it had a Russian dome on it. It cost millions in a time when millions of dollars was a lot of money. And I went away and wrote a story about doing an interview with Bob Dylan, although he didn't admit he was Bob Dylan. So it was kind of fun. But I should have told Bob at the time that I'd seen him in the summer of 1964 when he came to the Beatles hotel at the Kennedy Airport. It wasn't called Kennedy Airport at the time. It was called
Idlewild.
Idlewild, yeah. We were staying at the Idlewild Inn, which was at the airport. And at the Idlewild Inn, the next morning the Beatles were going home because they finished the Paramount Theater charity performance in New York. And we'd all gone back to the Idlewild Inn. And then I'm standing in the lobby, and in comes this guy looking like a gypsy with a backpack, and it was Bob Dylan. And I go up because we were all up in the same floor, and Bob goes in to the hotel room, and we are having a party with Brian Epstein outside, but we can see what's going on inside. We're having a few drinks. They didn't invite me in. I probably would have loved to have been invited in, but I didn't get in there. Brian went in there with the Beatles, and I could hear and see what was going on. And they actually put a towel on the at the foot of the door of the suite that they were all in, and we were sitting just outside the suite. And suddenly there was these fumes that were fairly familiar, wafting through under the cracks in the door. And when the door finally opened, I looked inside, and Ringo was lying on the floor giggling. And I think, well, I know because I found out what went on, was that Mr. Dylan brought them a high quality marijuana cigarette. The problem was they were fat. It was a fat marijuana cigarette. Now, I wasn't into marijuana cigarettes, so, if you'd shown it to me, I would have thought it was a sausage or something. Because you can smoke sausages, can't you? But you usually eat them rather than inhale them. So what happened was, and I discovered, was that Bob Dylan showed up, pulled out his high-grade marijuana cigarette, lit up, and gave it to Ringo. Now, Ringo did not know the diplomacy about smoking a fat marijuana cigarette. No, neither did I, but Ringo thought the cigarette was for him. So he smoked the whole thing, and he ended up rolling about the floor, giggling. So Mr. Dylan, when he realized that he wasn't going to get his cigarette back, provided other smoking utensils for the other Beatles, and they all started smoking, but they passed it around. And by the time the door opened and the smoke enveloped me and everybody else in the adjoining room, even Brian Epstein, who was in the room, was a little bit out of control. And Derek Taylor, who came out, was also a little bit high, and it was a kind of a party in which Mr. Dylan introduced the Beatles to a high quality grade marijuana, and the Beatles never forgot that, because later on they became quite familiar with pot and smoking, and also they went on to try other more how should I say diplomatically, more stronger chemical attractions.
Wow, that's a great story, and I'm glad you told it, because I know the story that, or at least the rumor was going around, that Dylan introduced marijuana to the Beatles. But I never heard any stories quite like the one you gave me.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing was, sorry to interrupt you, Warren, but I was there, saw Dylan go in, saw them, when and you could smell it. You knew what a good quality marijuana smelled like.
Sure.
It has a unique odor.
Yes, it does.
Of course, the Beatles then went on to LSD and all sorts of other things, and they became. And John, of course, tried other drugs when he was in New York, and they weren't angels on that front. And I think, who was it? Paul was arrested coming back from Japan one day for having marijuana, and here we are in 2020 when marijuana is legal in many states. So times they are a changing, as the Beatles didn't sing, but Bob Dylan did.
Right. Yeah, very good analysis there. I'm going to digress a little bit and go back to Elvis. Elvis sort of fell apart at the end of his life, and it must be hard to live inside sort of a bubble due to fame. Did the Beatles do better because they had each other and Elvis was alone the whole time?
Yes, I think, Warren, you've absolutely synthesized the problem. Elvis was himself. Elvis was the El Jefe. He was the numero uno and all that sort of stuff. The Memphis Mafia deferred to him. I mean, they weren't his advisors. Colonel Parker really didn't have much say in that. Elvis just went off the tracks. I mean, I remember interviewing Priscilla, and Priscilla is a lovely lady, but she was a young girl at the time they met. They met in Germany when Elvis was in the military. She was naive. She was barely a teenager, so she had no control over Elvis. I mean, I think his mother and father did, but once they died, Elvis was kind of rootless. And Colonel Parker, well, I think he had control fiscally, but not personally. So Elvis, as you pointed out a moment ago, was on his own, and he did what he wanted to. There were no curbs on him. I mean, I'm not an Elvis expert. I've read a few books. I interviewed Priscilla, who sort of was a survivor. And the story is that Elvis was out of control. I mean, he was a generous man with the people, his family, his Memphis Mafia people. I mean, I met somebody the other day who said to me, I had a car dealership in Memphis, and one day Elvis came in and ordered 4 Cadillacs. He told me this about 3 weeks ago. 4 Cadillacs. I said, how can you drive 4 Cadillacs? And Elvis said, well, they're for my pals. So Elvis was a generous man to his lackeys, to his assistants, or however well his pals. But was, as you pointed out, completely rudderless in his life. If he'd had somebody strong in his life, he probably might still be around today. But
I agree with that. When the Beatles were splitting up, did you realize it was happening from afar, or did you learn of it along with everyone else?
Well, once the Beatles went back to England, I didn't see them. I mean, I saw John years later, I saw Ringo years later, I saw Paul years later. But I did hear from time to time from Derek Taylor. Now, Derek was a brilliantly funny man, a Liverpool man, a journalist who used to work for the newspaper that I worked for. So we were very close. And then one year, Derek had a big row with Brian Epstein, and he left the Beatles and he moved to California, and we teamed up again. I became pally with Derek and his wife Joan. They came to my wedding. We were friendly that way. I'd see him every other day. He would handle the Beach Boys or Paul Revere and the Raiders, because a lot of the American rock groups, I'm getting off a little bit to your question, a lot of the American rock groups wanted Derek Taylor to sprinkle his Beatle magic dust on them.
Yeah.
So they hired him, as I say, the Beach Boys and Chris Hillman and the Byrds. And so Derek and I were close, and Derek would tell me, well, Brian is having problems with the boys. But I will say this about Derek. He was very loyal to the Beatles, and he would not tell tales out of school, but you could tell things were happening. And Derek knew what was going on. Derek would call Brian. Derek would call the boys. Derek was hugely close and friendly with George Harrison, so much so that even when Derek left the employment of the Beatles, when George Harrison came to America, Derek was his press man. And Derek, of course, wrote George Harrison's book, his memoir. They did it together. So Derek was he was the link, and I knew things were not going well, but I didn't know, and to be honest with you, I didn't know that they would definitely go their separate ways as they did 50 years ago this year.
Right. Great story there. When John became so enamored with Yoko, what effect do you see that it had on the group? And did you get to meet Yoko?
Yes, I did get to meet Yoko, but I met Yoko after John died. But the rumors were, and they were pretty. I mean, Yoko was no shrinking violet, as I said earlier in the conversation. She was tough. She knew what she wanted. John just did basically what she wanted. And I knew that Yoko was showing up at recording sessions, and the Beatles were upset. They said, who is this woman you're bringing in? And the Beatles were very upset at Yoko. And a lot of people have said Yoko broke up the Beatles, but I don't think she did. I think she was one of the key elements of them breaking up, because as the world knows, John went to Los Angeles with Yoko to do therapy, primal therapy with Yoko, which resulted in John and Yoko doing a new record, which was a very personal record. Primal therapy, for those of your listeners who don't know, was started by a guy called Art Janoff. And he wrote a book. John liked his book. John said, come and see me. Art came to see him in England, and Art and said, you can do my therapy, but you've got to come to LA. And John and Yoko came to LA for 6 months, did the therapy, did their next album, and it was a great success. Mm-hmm. So Yoko was very much a part of John's life, because John wanted her, and the Beatles weren't happy about Yoko coming in. As far as they were concerned, she was an interloper, and so she wasn't the reason for the breakup, but she certainly didn't help heal the problem.
Yes.
And Yoko, well, last time I spoke to her was quite a few years ago. Today, she is still the keeper of the flame of John Lennon, and that's what she does in life. She's a real tough lady. I'll tell you one thing. A few years ago, I was very lucky to bring the John Lennon bus to my hometown. The John Lennon bus is an incredible recording studio that goes around the world, showing kids how to record and stuff like that. It's an international symbol of John's legacy.
Mm-hmm.
Before I was able to get the bus to come to my town, the guy that arranged it for me, and a very nice guy called Brian Vinchick, had to run it by the people that ran the bus, who had to run it by Yoko. So Yoko rules the Lennon kingdom with an iron fist, and makes sure that nobody takes advantage of her late husband.
Yes. I understand that. And unfortunately, she runs it with an iron fist so much that she didn't even give Julian a chance to capitalize on anything.
Yes, well, that's another situation. I mean, look, Warren.
Mm-hmm.
Every family has its skeletons. Every family behaves in ways you wouldn't believe, and the Beatles families are no exception. But I'll tell you one quick story which has a happy ending.
Okay.
I've never told this before. Louise Harrison, the sister of George, was very close to her brother, and George left left a legacy in his will to look after Louise. Well, Louise was not, and she's around. Sorry, I say was not, is not the most diplomatic lady on the face of this earth. Because she didn't approve of George's second wife, there was a rift in the family, and they weren't talking to, after the death of George, they weren't talking to each other.
Mm-hmm.
But then the happy ending is that then, when Louise Harrison was ill in the last couple of years and was really out of money, who came to the rescue? George's widow.
Right.
Nobody knows this, but George's widow now has opened her heart and the purse strings to help Louise Harrison, and which I think is nice, wonderful.
Right. I got to meet Louise at Beatles Fest a few years back, and very nice lady. She really liked my wife.
Yes.
And she autographed a book for her, which was very nice. And yeah, it's nice to know that she's being looked after.
That's the punchline. She's being looked after by George's wife, and I must say that it was very terrific of George's widow to do that, because
Yes, it was.
Because Louise at one time wasn't too gracious to George's new wife, or what, she wasn't a new wife, but you know, the one that he married after the divorce from, I think it was Patty, was it? Patty was the first wife.
Right.
And then, anyway, so that's an interesting story about, and I'm not sure how we got there, Warren, but it's an it's a sweet and nice thing to do, and it basically shows. And I guess I was saying that in a family, there's always feuds and arguments and disputes. I mean, whenever anybody dies with a lot of money, the big battles are between the family members to see who gets most of it. So it's not unusual.
Yeah, I agree with that. I got one last question, and then I'll hand it over to the bulldog. If you can you please play along and speculate for a moment? Do you think that had John lived, the four might have played together again?
It's an interesting question. And the answer, I think, is probably yes. I mean, look at the Rolling Stones. Here we are today, and they're still playing together, even though they've had disputes and arguments and all that sort of stuff. I think that as one ages, and if John had been allowed to age, that they would have come together. That's a good song, Come Together.
There you go.
And now George is dead. And the nice thing is when Paul played in LA in his concert, Ringo, who lives in LA, came along on stage and performed with him. I didn't perform the whole show because it's Paul's show,
Right.
but I think it's nice that they realize that they're the surviving two. So to answer your question, and it's pure speculation, and I said to you earlier in the conversation that I remember John said to me that Muhammad Ali, he met, and Muhammad Ali was trying to bring them together to do a concert in New York. So I think over the years, there is little doubt if they were all alive again, they would have come together and performed on stage. But no, that's impossible, of course.
Right. Well, I totally agree with your answer there. I believe as we get older, and we start to realize that we won't be on this earth for too much longer, things get a little less complicated, should I say, and you start to forgive and forget a little easier.
You just perfectly put it there. You mellow, you realize that life, no matter how joyful and wonderful it can be, is fairly short, and therefore, you've got to kiss and make up in any way you can, because as I say, life is short, and to be honest with you, we're talking in a period in American history, in world history, when it's even more important. I mean, the world is turned upside down as we speak, all over the world, and what's been happening is people are reaching out to people. People are reaching out to people who they haven't spoken to for a long time.
Right.
So it's a come, as I say, keep using that phrase, coming together.
All right.
All that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Right. Good answer. And I thank you very much for letting me speak with you again, Ivor. You're one of my favorites.
Thank you.
And I love having you on the show, and I love your stories. And from here, I'm going to hand it off to the bulldog.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark.
You're welcome.
Changing gears considerably, in 2019, you released a fascinating new book, Manson Exposed. It's not your first book on the case, a reporter's 50-year journey into madness and murder. You'd also written, I believe, the first book that told about the case, and you played quite a role in Vincent Bugliosi's prosecution, even if that was unintentional with your book. So I have to ask, this is fascinating stuff, and it's a case that sticks with America. It's part of the dark part of her soul that we try to exercise, which is what I think brings so many to still look at that case, the horror of it. Could you please tell us about the Manson case and how you became involved in reporting on it?
Well, what happened it was in 1969. I was a reporter working for the same newspaper as I was working for when I covered the Beatles. And I got a call one Saturday morning, and they said there's been a bunch of murders in Beverly Hills in a high rent district. Get over there. We're not sure who the victims are, but be there. So I rushed over and discovered that there were a lot of television, radio, and newspaper people milling outside the gate of a house, a large estate on Cielo Drive in the Beverly Hills area, which is the high rent district of Los Angeles. And as the day wore on, we learned that the murdered victims were Sharon Tate, a beautiful actress, Jay Sebring, a famous hairdresser, stylist to the movie stars like Steve McQueen and Paul Newman, and their friends Wojtek Frykowski, Abigail Folger, and a young teenager nobody knew who was dead in a car. And finally, we learned that they'd all been murdered, and it was shocking. It was scary, and nobody knew why. And there were all sorts of rumors, all sorts of reasons, all sorts of wild stories, black magic, drug deals gone bad. And for the next 4 months, nobody knew why they had been killed, who killed them. I should add that 24 hours after the murders of Sharon Tate, the beautiful actress, and the wife of the film director Roman Polanski, 24 hours after those murders, a similar murder took place 15 miles away in Los Angeles. The police investigated that, and they said it's probably a copycat killing, has nothing to do with the Sharon Tate murders. But of course, it did have a lot to do with the Sharon Tate murders, because 4 months later, we discovered that Charles Manson, who was the leader of a kind of hippie group of runaway kids living on a rather crappy, smelly old movie ranch outside LA, was the man responsible for the murders. And so what I did is I went along to the Spahn movie ranch, because Manson and the girls had been arrested, and I didn't know what to expect. And I found some members of the Manson family there who were willing to talk to me. To cut a long story short, they spun me a story that was unbelievable. They said Charlie Manson brainwashed the members of his family by using lyrics from the Beatles' White Album, songs like Helter Skelter, Piggies, Revolution, to incite them to murder. Now, when I heard that, I thought, what a lot of old, absolute garbage. It makes no sense. I knew the Beatles. I knew their lyrics. I knew their music. Not intimately, but I knew it. And the idea that the Beatles' music was being used to orchestrate mass murder struck me as so outrageous. But indeed, that was a story that I discovered from the remnants at the Spahn movie ranch. And I went away with this story. And before the trial of Manson and his girls unfolded, I wrote a book called 5 to Die, in which I outlined this crazy theory for the murders. I didn't know it at the time, but the Deputy District Attorney Vincent Bugliosi, and Aaron Stovitz, who worked with him, had seen my book and had seen this crazy Beatles music lyrics made me do it thesis. And lo and behold, when I covered the trial in January of 1970, Mr. Bugliosi, the prosecutor, laid out the Beatles music was the reason why they went out to kill. The Beatles music, according to Manson's interpretation, anticipated a riot between blacks and whites in America, rivers of blood, the country being laid bare by this revolution, by this apocalypse. But Charlie Manson and his girls would escape by going to the desert and living in an underground city where they would survive. I mean, doesn't that sound insane?
It's not Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, that's for sure.
Definitely not. I'd say not even close at all there at all. Yeah. But anyway, so that was my introduction. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Yeah, that wasn't too gory, was it, Bob? That was a wonderful film with Jimmy Stewart, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. The great Jimmy Stewart, one of my favorites. He's kind of, I guess I made the joke of it because in my mind he's the polar opposite, or at least his image as an actor is the Finer Parts of America, where, and It's a Wonderful Life on Christmas.
Oh, yes.
I watch every Christmas, and this is kind of the polar opposite in imagery in my mind of what on with this case, and I give you great credit for. I'm sure writing about it takes a toll, and such. So I give you great credit for that. But as I've said before, I consider you very brave and beyond professional. And you had to live through these things, including some threats to yourself and worries for those around you. Can you discuss some of that?
Well, one of the things I should say, and it's nice of you to say how brave I was, but I wasn't. I was young and foolish, really, in retrospect. When you're younger, you think you're invincible. But what did scare the daylights out of me was the fact that after I wrote Five to Die, and it was out, and Charles Manson's lawyer brought it into court and tried to get the judge to send the trial to San Francisco or another town, claiming that my book had sullied things for his client, and that the book was a bad influence. The girls that were not arrested with Charles Manson were still free. They were sitting outside the courtroom every day. They shaved their heads bald and they carved crosses and swastikas in their forehead. And on the first day of the trial, I remember this vividly, I saw one of the girls, Squeaky Frommy was her name, Lynn Squeaky Frommy, sitting outside there, and she knew I had written the book. And she was not very happy with me, obviously, because I had slighted her leader. I had bad-mouthed Manson. And she suddenly almost sang to me, and you can never forget this, Ivor, hi, kind of a little girl voice. Do you know what it feels like to have a sharp knife slip down your throat? Well, I wasn't going to answer with a quick quip, but I did go to the nearest payphone in those days, call my wife and told her, Sally, take Rebecca, our young daughter, and leave the house because I've just had a death threat. And she left, and it was scary. And, thinking back, it was a chilling moment. And then for the next year, I sat in court while the gruesome details of these stabbings, these senseless murders played out in a packed courtroom. And it was weird. It was weird because when I heard the district attorney lay out for the jury the reason, and kind of blaming in a bizarre way the Beatles lyrics for the murders, it was all surreal and unreal and ridiculous. But I guess the bottom line is the jury believed it, and the jury convicted Manson and the girls.
Some things are so atrocious. I'm trying to find the right words. They're so atrocious that it's hard to find catharsis from them. I'm watching from a distance. You were actually up close, and they actually threatened you and such. I just wonder, as you retold the story, we talked about the passage of time before, as sometimes there's a great healer, and we reach out to other people, and we find and extend forgiveness. I was just wondering, in this case, it's very hard to see much catharsis, but did you feel any as you came to the anniversary and brought this wonderful book forth on such a tough subject to write about?
Well, it was difficult to re-examine the moment of fear that I had then, But don't forget, I did have the ability. I mean, Squeaky Frommy is still alive. She's still around. She's still a devotee, a believer in Manson, although Manson is dead. Going reliving some of that was kind of a bit chilling, but you know what happens is, even though it's a very personal story, and my book is a personal story, because I went to France to interview Roman Polanski, and it was a painful thing for him to talk about his wife Sharon being murdered and their unborn child being murdered, and Polanski, you know, has gone through his own private hell. And then I went to see Doris Day's son Terry Melcher and talked to him about it, and he was also, his life was destroyed by the connection with Manson. He never was the same again. He became a dependent on drugs. He nearly killed himself in a motorcycle accident. He died very young of cancer, and broke up with his girlfriend, the beautiful actress Candice Bergen. So I mean, today, 50 odd years after the Manson murders, the scars are still there for not necessarily me, but for everybody who got suckered into this terrible part of American criminal history. So it was, I mean, I'm a journalist. This is what I do. I write for a living. I've done it for over half a century. And so part is emotion and part is I'm doing a job that I've done all my life. And so what you're looking for, Bob, is, did I mean, I tell you this, I think after writing the book, I was sick for a bit, and I'm pretty healthy. And I think the strain, in retrospect, did take its toll on my body, my aging body, because when I look back for the last year or 18 months of writing a book, having to dig deep into this cesspit of American criminal history was difficult.
Well, I know you're a soccer player, and you look pretty fit to me. So
thank you. But my soccer playing days are over there, Bob. But I like to watch.
In my book, you're a strapping, handsome soccer player reporter in my 50s.
There you go.
Manson evidently, had a dark intelligence and was quite manipulative, and he'd been in the quote system, in the prison system and such, and all that goes with it for some time. But many people have been through the system in the same way Manson has. Perhaps it's an unanswerable question, and as someone who's researched it, I try to humble myself in my thinking, and sometimes you think you come to a conclusion, and I try to step back and see the bigger picture. I guess as I get older, I do that more. It just seems very strange to me what made this man stand out from the only other people who have an experience like that, broken lives in a prison system, to make him such a vicious, controlling, I believe it's mesmerizing, after the French psychologist, I believe, dropping a nickel and dime word there. But I think you know what I'm trying to ask. What made this man stand out and need to be such an awful force? And it seems like for no reason. What did he gain from this? Nothing. Taking this control over people is probably not an answer to it. But what do you think went wrong there, if my question makes sense?
Well, first of all, he grew up with a father he never knew. He was pretty abandoned as a young man. He spent most of his life in reform schools, reform schools that were brutal to him. He was beaten up, he was sexually attacked, and yet he managed to survive that. And then he used the prison system for an education. He was educated in jail. He knew very little else about life except what he learned in jail. And jail was a survival technique. He was a brilliant survivor in prison. He was a very small man and threatened and beaten up by his fellow inmates. And somehow he learned that if you can survive in jail, when you get out into freedom, you can learn what you learned in jail and use it to your advantage. And he was a manipulator. And he suddenly graduated from the school of shitty, awful, terrible knocks, the prison system. And when he came out, he realized he could use the techniques he'd used in jail to manipulate. And he was a marvelous manipulator. He would meet somebody, he'd meet a girl, and within 3 minutes he would sum up her problems. She had a problem with her father, with her boyfriend, with her lover, and he would squirm his way into their soul with conversation and dialogue. And that's how he got all these young, impressionable, sometimes demented young women to follow him and do what he said. But the ultimate horror is to go out and kill people as when somebody tells you to do that. I mean, it happens in war, but it's a whole different set of rules. So Manson was a manipulator, and he handed out all sorts of drugs to the followers, and they were, I believe, and I'm sure, were somewhat under the influence of the drugs he gave them, on top of all the brainwashing techniques. He was a great brainwasher, and he could talk to anyone, and he became friends with Terry Melcher, Doris Day's son, with Dennis Wilson, the drummer of the Beach Boys, who thought he was, I don't know, he thought he was the new Bob Dylan, believe it or not. And a lot of people were impressed
Bob
by
Dylan just got a chill through his spine, and he's not sure why.
Yeah, well, I know he did. Wherever you are, Bob, where is Bob today? I don't know. Not you, Bob, but where is Bob Dylan
I'm guessing he's in Malibu in his dome.
In his dome, yeah, in his Russian dome, yeah. But anyway, so Manson, look, if anybody wants to know what Manson is like and how he is a man of many masks, many faces, I suggest they go to YouTube and watch him being interviewed by Diane Sawyer, by Tom Snyder, by Ron Reagan Jr. He is a manipulator. He is a performer. He is a man of many personalities. And you can see it all in those interviews, because he turns it on. He becomes angry. He becomes gibberish. He becomes the lunatic. He becomes the monster. He's a play actor. He's a good actor, impressive actor. But there's that streak of homicide which nobody can forgive. And that was his secret. That was the way he did it until his dying day. I mean, I spoke in my book, Manson Exposed, a reporter's 50-year journey into murder and madness. I spoke to a prison guard, a guy who was an intelligent, bright man, who'd been in the prison system for 30, 40 years. And he said, Manson became kind of a buddy in jail. We would have philosophical conversation. Manson would say to me, John, I'm not the prisoner, you're the prisoner to life. You have to get up, you have to come to work, you have to feed the family, you have to put bread on the table. And here I am, sitting in prison, 3 meals a day, and people give me respect, sort of. So Manson is a Machiavellian character. That word, that Italian description of him is just it. I mean, if you had Charles Manson on the program with you as you're talking to me, he could charm you. He could try to charm you. He could give you gibberish. He could spin stories. You would be fascinated. He's a fascinating character, but he's also a man with no remorse. A man who, to his dying day, said, "I never killed anybody." But that, so, a great psychological study. if you want to bother to study him psychologically.
Well put, and I hand over to Warren.
Well, Ivor, intelligent is a word that you wouldn't associate with Charles Manson. But he seems to be very, very smart and knows how to use his street smarts
Exactly.
For people. Can you explain a little bit what the difference would be between being intelligent and having street smarts?
Well, to be honest with you, Warren, I think it's a combination. You basically take the street smarts that you have, and you realize how effective it's been in your day-to-day life. And as I said a little earlier, I think Manson saw himself, he wanted to be a rock star. It never worked for him. He wrote music, he wrote songs. He got ripped off by Dennis Wilson when he gave him a song called One Thing, and Dennis Wilson used it in a record and changed the name and didn't give him credit. But it's an interesting question. I mean, if Charles Manson went to a dinner party that we had, would he be the center of attraction? Would he be the one that we would all want to listen to?
I believe so, yes.
Well, there you go. Thank heavens we don't have to worry about him coming to our dinner parties, do we?
I hope not.
but in a strange way, look, the prison guard that worked with Manson for a long time said that he was the star in the jail. People came to see him. I mean, when I say came to see him, the head of the federal office of the prison system came one day and he wanted to see Manson. He wanted to meet Manson. I mean, come on. And when Diane Sawyer did her interview with Charles Manson, one of her young producers wanted to have a picture taken with Manson in jail. Mass murderer. So, and then another pal in jail with Manson told me that they would bring in young teenagers trying to show them the evils of life, and they take them to Manson's cell, and sometimes some would say, Charlie, they're here, and Charlie Manson would come out and kind of play the lunatic or scream and do that. So people, I mean, he was a grotesque celebrity.
Yeah, it's kind of scary to me to know that some people have that ability.
Yes, I mean, look, let me ask you both this. What's the name of the guy, the handsome guy, the handsome killer that used to meet these beautiful young women and then kill them? He's a well-known mass murderer.
Is that Bundy?
Bundy, Ted Bundy. Okay, Ted Bundy. I mean, Ted Bundy came into your, not say your living room. He probably wouldn't come into your living room, but let's say you met him at a party or at a dinner party. I mean, he was glib, he was handsome. I wouldn't say Manson was handsome, but they have these psychopaths have an ability to be great conversationalists. They can be charming. I mean, Bundy charmed all these young women, and just because you're a killer, you can be suave and debonair, as we used to say. So, unless you look like Manson, I wouldn't say Manson was suave and debonair. That was
no Cary Grant.
No Cary Grant, exactly. But glib of tongue, entertaining, outrageously conversational, all those elements. And it's kind of an interesting subject, and I've never really talked about it. But I mean, just look at some of the mass murderers. And do they look like mass murderers? Charlie Manson does, because he was on the cover of Life magazine with those staring eyes. If you I mean, I always remember seeing a picture of Charlie Manson. I've got it in my book. Charlie Manson getting married. He looks like a handsome young man. He's clean shaven. He's with his bride. I mean, he looks like a good-looking young man. Who would think? But Manson knew. You know, he did all those things, carving his swastikas and letting his hair go crazy and wearing his coat of many colors and screaming at the judge. He knew when he went into court, he wanted the attention. He craved celebritydom. Celebritydom, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's very interesting stuff there. Tom O'Neill has written a new book called Chaos. We invited him on the show, hopefully to speak with you together. Do you have any thoughts on his work that you are comfortable sharing with us today in general?
Well, I have, yeah.
And would you like to do a show together with us?
Look, I'd love to do a show with him because I loved his book. I mean, he put blood, sweat, and tears into that book. I mean, it was over decades. It became, he says in his own book, he became obsessed by it. And you can become obsessed by it. So he's done a fascinating book, bringing up a lot of stuff I didn't know. Some of the stuff I might question when he comes up with a particular element. I would, yeah. So what I would say is I'd love to talk with him because his book shows the work he's put into it. And as I say, it has some absolutely intriguing material in there. He's obviously put, as I said, blood, sweat, and tears, and a lot more into it, and it shows. As I said, there are aspects that I might quibble with, but I didn't go to up some of the streets that he went, and vice versa. So I think, and I'd love to meet him on your show because I think we would have a good time, and we'd exchange a lot of interesting stuff. And he's a journalist, I'm a journalist. You know, we have our own take on life and take on this particular monstrous period in criminal history. So if you're listening, Tom, let's get together.
That sounds great to me, and that would be a great show and very interesting to say the least. You were there for the Beatles, RFK, Manson, and what else? Do you ever wonder how fate had you in all these places at key moments in history?
Well, as I said at the beginning of the conversation, I was a lucky guy. I happened to be at the right place at the right time, in the right city, got the right job offer, and I just did my job. I mean, the Beatles was a terrific ride. I wish I'd kept their autographs instead of giving them away. And I wish I'd kept the programs, the tickets, the Beatle wig that John took from me and threw out the window because he didn't like merchandising. But I was fortunate. I mean, I covered Ronald Reagan, who was an actor, became president. I remember getting a call to go to New Orleans, where Jim Garrison, the district attorney, said he'd solved the Kennedy murders, and he hadn't. And I went to the University of Mississippi in Oxford, Mississippi, smuggled myself in as a student and watched as James Meredith became the first Negro, which is what they called it then, Negro, to be enrolled in the Oxford, Mississippi University in Mississippi. And it followed rioting and murders, and not murders, rioting and deaths. And because I worked for a big newspaper, they sent me to wherever trouble was breaking out, whether it was riots, earthquakes, and wonderful, wonderful stories. Even they sent me to Australia, would you believe, after Mick Jagger's then girlfriend tried to kill herself with an overdose of drugs. She's still around, so she did very well. And so I got to travel on somebody else's dime and at the same time live a very active, intriguing, and captivating life. And I'm still here.
Yes,
Thank goodness.
and thank God that you still are, and it's a pleasure talking with you and hearing these stories firsthand. That's great stuff, and I enjoy being your friend, and I enjoy talking to you. You spoke about you wish you saved some of the items that you had during your days with the Beatles. Did you save anything at all? And if so, what do you have from those
Well,
days?
well, all I have is a bunch of some of the pictures of me with the Beatles. A terrific group shot, which is unique. I got a nice picture of me and George. But let me tell you the problem. The problem was, number one, I didn't think that over 50 years later, you and I would be talking about the Beatles. The Beatles
That's
never
true.
thought, the Beatles never thought they would last this long. I mean, they thought they would go home and maybe have another few years in the business and then go into other lines of lucrative work. So we never knew. We never knew. I mean, there are people around who had the vision to save programs and stuff like that, which are worth a fortune.
Hmm.
I didn't have it because as soon as I finished the Beatle tour, I went on the next day to a story about the Warren Commission report on the assassination of John Kennedy. So within 24 hours, I was concentrating on another story. If I had the good sense and the wisdom that I have now, I think, then it would have been a different kettle of fish. But there are people who do have this. There are people that kept, and if anybody out there that has the autographs that I gave you for your daughter, please send them back. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Great stuff. Thank you for that. Ivor, where can listeners find your books and keep up with you on the internet?
Do you have them there to hold up?
Oh yes, I do. Thank you. Yeah, well, everything you want to know about me is well, my last book, my current book is Manson Exposed, a reporter's 50-year journey into madness and murder. That came out a few months ago, and that is available at www.ivordavisbooks.com, and you can go onto my website and you can read more than you ever wanted to know about me, or you can also buy the book, or you can buy the book in any by going onto Amazon, by going onto Barnes and Noble, or anywhere like that. And then there's I'm sort of shamelessly promoting my Beatles and Me on Tour. And I should say, Beatles and Me on Tour is my fun escapade with the Beatles, as you know. And I should say that in the last month, my Manson book has come out on audio. So you can actually, when you've got time to spend walking the streets or the beaches and stuff like that, then you can get my audio book by going on to Audible Books, which is owned by Amazon. So that's a fun way, and it's well read, not by me, but by a man that sounds like me a little bit. So I would say basically that you can get my books that way, and of course the Penguin book, which is a children's book, A Change of Pace, if I may just flash this one. Ladies and gentlemen, the Penguins, which is a kind of the title is a comedic take on a guy who stood up in February 1964 and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles." So it's what Ed Sullivan said about the Beatles, I'm saying about the Penguins. Great rock group, the Penguins. So
Hear, hear.
so there we go. IvorDavisBooks.com, and I hope you enjoy whatever you decide. Your listeners, viewers enjoy whatever they decide. The kids' book, the Manson murders, or the Beatles, because the Beatles is still selling very well.
Yes, it is. The Beatles are selling excellent.
Deservedly so.
That's for sure. Will you help us close out the show and sing the end with us, Ivor? It's a tradition that we have on the show, and most of our guests help us sing it. Would you?
Yeah, I was very happy to join in with the line, but I want to tell you, I'm a good soccer player. I write fairly well, but as a singer, I leave much to be desired. So if
Uh,
you, so let's do it, but don't expect me to be the Paul McCartney of this trio.
It's for
what
fun. It's not for great singing. No worries.
you're going to be Paul McCartney to me because when people hear me, they get up and walk out of the room.
Okay, good.
You guys ready?
Ready.
And
And
in the end,
the, the love you take is equal
Is
to the love you make. Did I just jump ahead of it?
I think you
that's
took Warren's line too, but I liked it.
I like the way you did it, Ivor. We'll keep
Yeah.
it this way.
Okay. Thank you. You know what they say when I auditioned as a singer for the Beatles. They said, "Don't call us, we'll call you."
Maybe they were just calling when the phone rang. That might have been Ringo.
Yes, it's watching and saying, when can you show up?
Sign him up. Get him down here.
Indeed.
I really enjoyed the show. I enjoyed talking with you, Ivor. It's
Thank,
my pleasure,
thank you.
and I can't wait to get you and Tom O'Neill on the same show. That's going to be very interesting,
That should be fun.
and please, fans, be looking forward to that. It's going to be an interesting show.
Thank you.
Thank
All
you
the,
very much.
thank,
Thank you for always coming on and treating us so well.
thank you very much, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you both. And thanks for having me and tolerating me for all this time.
And my pleasure, Ivor. And
Whenever I want to know facts, figures, information about the fabulous Beatles, there's just one place I go to, and all the time, and it's a precious resource, and it's Beatles magazine. So if you need to know about the Beatles, anything, Beatles magazine is the Encyclopedia Britannica Beatles. How about that? I think so. And here's my book, by the way, The Beatles and Me on Tour, which tells everybody what happened when I got involved with the Beatles on their first American tour.